March 1938. The world watched in stunned silence as Nazi Germany marched into Austria. This annexation, known as the Anschluss, sent shockwaves across Europe. It marked a turning point in the Nazi regime's aggressive expansion. Austria, once a sovereign nation, was absorbed into the Third Reich. This act of aggression revealed Hitler's true intentions and foreshadowed the horrors to come. The Anschluss had immediate and far-reaching consequences. It plunged the continent into a state of fear and uncertainty. The annexation of Austria was swift and brutal. Within days, the Nazi machinery was in full force, dismantling Austrian institutions and imposing its ideology. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, wasted no time in rounding up political opponents and those deemed undesirable. This included Jews, Roma, communists, and anyone who dared to oppose the Nazi regime. The world witnessed the systematic stripping away of basic human rights and freedoms. The Anschluss was met with a mix of apprehension and indifference from the international community. Some nations, wary of another devastating war, chose appeasement. They hoped that by conceding to Hitler's demands, they could avoid further conflict. Others remained silent, unwilling to confront the growing Nazi threat. This lack of decisive action emboldened Hitler, fueling his ambitions for further conquest. The annexation of Austria was not just a geopolitical event, it was a human tragedy. It shattered the lives of millions and set in motion a chain of events that would culminate in the deadliest conflict in human history. The world, slow to react to the Anschluss, would soon face the consequences of its inaction. November 1938, the Nazi regime unleashed a wave of violence against Jews across Germany and Austria in a horrific event that came to be known as Kristallnacht, or the Night of Broken Glass. This pogrom, a state-sanctioned attack on a specific group of people, marked a significant escalation in the persecution of Jews. It shattered the illusion of safety and normalcy that many Jews had clung to. Over the course of 2 days and nights, Nazi mobs, fueled by anti-Semitic propaganda, rampaged through Jewish neighborhoods. They vandalized Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues. The streets were littered with broken glass, a chilling testament to the violence and destruction. Synagogues, places of worship, and community centers were set ablaze, their sacred scrolls desecrated. The human toll of Kristallnacht was devastating. Thousands of Jews were arrested and sent to concentration camps, subjected to unimaginable brutality. Many were beaten, tortured, and killed. The violence of Kristallnacht sent shockwaves throughout the Jewish community, both in Germany and abroad. Kristallnacht was a turning point in the Nazi persecution of Jews. It shattered any remaining hope of coexistence and made it brutally clear that Jews were no longer safe in Germany or Austria. The event triggered a mass exodus of Jews desperate to escape the Nazi regime's clutches. The Anschluss and Kristallnacht created a desperate humanitarian crisis. Thousands of Jews facing increasing persecution and violence sought refuge in other countries. They sought safety and a chance to rebuild their lives, shattered by the Nazi regime's brutality. However, they were met with closed doors and indifference from much of the world.
Countries, grappling with their own economic woes and political anxieties, were reluctant to accept large numbers of Jewish refugees. Immigration quotas were restrictive, and even those who managed to navigate the bureaucratic hurdles faced discrimination and prejudice.
The United States, often seen as a beacon of hope for those fleeing persecution, proved to be a significant disappointment. The US government, influenced by anti-Semitism and isolationist sentiments, maintained strict immigration quotas that severely limited the number of Jewish refugees allowed entry. Despite the pleas of humanitarian organizations and the growing evidence of Nazi atrocities, the US government remained largely unmoved. The St. Louis affair, in which a ship carrying over 900 Jewish refugees was turned away from the shores of the United States, became a stark symbol of the world's indifference to the plight of the Jewish people. The international community's failure to provide refuge to those fleeing Nazi persecution remains a dark chapter in human history. It is a stark reminder of the dangers of indifference and the consequences of inaction in the face of evil. The film industry, with its global reach and influence, had the power to raise awareness about the plight of Jewish refugees and to pressure governments to open their doors. However, Hollywood, driven by economic interests and a fear of alienating the German market, remained largely silent on the issue.
Hollywood studios, with the exception of Warner Brothers, were hesitant to produce films that were critical of the Nazi regime or that depicted the plight of Jewish refugees. They feared that such films would be controversial and could jeopardize their profits. The German market, while not as lucrative as the domestic one, was still significant, and studios were unwilling to risk losing it.
This silence was particularly deafening given the large number of Jewish refugees who had found their way to Hollywood. Many of them were talented writers, directors, actors, and musicians who had fled Nazi persecution. They brought with them their stories, their experiences, and their desperate pleas for help. However, Hollywood studios, more concerned with profits than with principles, largely ignored their pleas. They continued to churn out escapist fare, choosing to entertain rather than to inform or to challenge. In stark contrast to the apathy and indifference displayed by other Hollywood studios, Warner Brothers emerged as a lone voice of conscience. Led by the Warner Brothers, Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack, the studio refused to be silenced by fear or greed.
We were determined to use our platform to expose the horrors of Nazism and to rally support for its victims.
The Warner Brothers, themselves children of Jewish immigrants, felt a deep sense of responsibility to speak out against injustice. They witnessed firsthand the discrimination and prejudice faced by immigrants in the United States.
We recognized the dangerous parallels between the anti-Semitism that fueled the Nazi regime and the bigotry that existed within our own country.
Driven by a sense of moral obligation and a commitment to social justice, the Warner Brothers decided to make a film that would expose the truth about the Nazi regime and its insidious agenda. They were determined to use the power of cinema to awaken the world to the threat of Nazism. The decision to make a film critical of the Nazi regime was a risky one. The Nazi government, known for its ruthlessness and its vast network of spies and informants, had a long reach. They had threatened to boycott American films if Hollywood continued to produce content that they deemed anti-German.
We will not tolerate any film that portrays Germany in a negative light. There will be consequences.
Undeterred by the threats, the Warner Brothers pressed on with their plans. They hired German screenwriter Wolfgang Reinhardt, who had fled Nazi Germany, to write the screenplay. Reinhardt, using his first-hand knowledge of the Nazi regime, crafted a gripping and suspenseful story that exposed the inner workings of the Nazi spy network operating within the United States.
The production of the film was shrouded in secrecy. We knew that the Nazi government would stop at nothing to prevent the film's release. We received numerous death threats, and our offices were placed under constant surveillance.
In 1939, Warner Brothers released Confessions of a Nazi Spy, a film that dared to expose the truth about the Nazi regime's espionage activities within the United States. The film, based on actual events, told the story of a Nazi spy ring operating in America and the FBI agents who worked tirelessly to bring them to justice.
Confessions of a Nazi Spy was a groundbreaking film. It was the first major Hollywood production to directly confront the Nazi regime and to expose its insidious agenda.
The film's release was met with a mix of praise and condemnation. Many Americans, still clinging to isolationist sentiments and reluctant to believe the full extent of the Nazi threat, dismissed the film as propaganda. They accused Warner Brothers of warmongering and of trying to stir up anti-German sentiment. Section 8, The Legacy of Confessions, a film that dared to speak out. Despite facing criticism and threats, Confessions of a Nazi Spy stood as a powerful testament to the importance of speaking truth to power. The film's legacy extends far beyond its initial release. It serves as a reminder of the dangers of complacency and the consequences of remaining silent in the face of evil. Confessions of a Nazi Spy helped to raise awareness about the Nazi threat at a time when many Americans were still in denial. The film's realistic portrayal of Nazi espionage activities shattered the illusion that the United States was immune to the dangers of fascism. It forced Americans to confront the uncomfortable reality that the Nazi threat was not confined to Europe, but was present within their own borders. The film also played a role in galvanizing public support for the Allied cause. By exposing the true nature of the Nazi regime, the film helped to turn public opinion against Germany and to build support for American intervention in the war. Section 9. Hollywood's Reckoning, a moral debt acknowledged too late. In the years following World War II, as the full extent of the Holocaust became known, Hollywood was forced to confront its own complicity in the silence that had allowed the Nazi regime to flourish. The industry's reluctance to speak out against Nazism, driven by economic considerations and a fear of controversy, had come at a terrible cost. The stories of those who had perished in the Holocaust and the survivors who bore witness to its horrors weighed heavily on the conscience of the film industry. Hollywood, once a dream factory that had chosen to ignore the realities of the world, was now forced to confront the consequences of its silence. The industry's response was slow and often inadequate. Some studios attempted to atone for their past inaction by producing films that dealt with the Holocaust and its aftermath. However, these films often struggled to find an audience, and many critics accused Hollywood of exploiting the tragedy for commercial gain. Section 10. The Lessons of History, Remembering the Past, Shaping the Future. The story of Hollywood's dark Nazi secret is a cautionary tale about the dangers of silence and the consequences of prioritizing profit over principles. It is a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming evil, individuals have a choice to make, to speak out against injustice or to remain silent. The lessons of the past are especially relevant in today's world, where we are witnessing a resurgence of intolerance, discrimination, and violence. From the rise of far-right movements to the persecution of minorities, the echoes of the past are all too present. It is imperative that we learn from the mistakes of those who came before us. We cannot afford to remain silent in the face of injustice, no matter how uncomfortable or inconvenient it may be to speak out. Section 11. A Call to Action, Combating Intolerance and Injustice. The fight against intolerance and injustice is a continuous one. It requires constant vigilance, unwavering courage, and a willingness to speak truth to power. It demands that we challenge discrimination in all its forms and that we stand up for the rights of all people. We must use our voices to amplify the voices of the marginalized and the oppressed. We must challenge hate speech, discrimination, and violence whenever and wherever we see it. We must create a world where everyone feels safe, respected, and valued. The legacy of Hollywood's dark Nazi secret is a reminder that silence is not an option. We must never forget the past, and we must use its lessons to shape a more just and equitable future for all.